Hope is definitely different than a wish. It's very, very different than a wish, and it's infinitely more effective. Wishing is something, just wishing for something, it doesn't really take effort. Hope does take effort. It takes a lot of effort, and hope is what can actually shape your life. It is very energizing. It is strengthening. With something like a wish is passive and it can be potentially weakening. And I will get into that, talking about some like very real examples of how hope can be energizing and strengthening, and wishing is something that can be potentially weakening. So I want to share a couple of experiments that they did with rats. Now, one of them is very cruel. You know, they often did very cruel experiments with animals, even with humans in the past. So not that long ago, in the 1950s, this experiment that they did is they put some rats in buckets to test their ability to swim. Apparently rats are really good swimmers. And what they found is that on average, rats could swim for about 15 minutes before they drowned. So they first figured that out. And then the psychologist did a second experiment. So he would put the rats in, and when the rats would be swimming along, it's been 15 minutes and they're starting to sink, he would then take the rat out of the bucket, dry them off, let them rest. And as soon as they were rested up enough, then he would put them back into the bucket. And you know how long those rats were able to swim at that point? Remember, 15 minutes before was how long they swam before they drowned. They swam for 60 hours. They swam for 60 hours. This is one of the examples that we have of a fellow mammalian animal who was able to survive and go for so much longer because it had the power of hope. The power of hope. If you have ever, I don't know if you have seen the movie Touching the Void. If you are looking for an inspirational movie about the power of hope, I recommend the book or the movie Touching the Void. It's really good. And you'll see another example of that. Okay, so that's experiment number one with rats. Here's another experiment that they've done with rats, those poor rats. With this experiment, they had two sets of rats, okay? So in one group, they taught it something that's called learned helplessness. This is something that happens with humans as well. What they did was they gave the rats these painful electric shocks that they had no control over. So this was learned helplessness. They learned that they had no control over what was going to happen. Now there was a second group who they gave the same painful electric shocks to them, but they gave them some control over when the shocks would end. So they were able to end the shocks. Then what they did is they injected cancer cells into, my contact just did something weird. They injected cancer cells into both sets of rats, the ones who, through their own efforts, had been able to escape those painful shocks, the ones who had the same shock but were powerless to stop it, right? And what they did was they injected enough cancer cells into all of the rats, this whole group of rats, that half would be expected to die. Now, of the hopeful rats, the ones who learned that it was like there was some hope that they could maybe control something about the outcome, only 27% of those rats died. Of the other rats who had this learned helplessness, they basically had no hope, 63% of them died from cancer. So once again, that is a second proof of the power of hope, that it can actually help. It helps your actual immune system. It helps give you more power to be able to fight against something that is going on in your own body. In fact, they say that up to 50% of the improvement from some antidepressant drugs is the placebo effect. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with these drugs. It just means that faith and hope and love, that these are all things that are a really important part of healing. So we're talking about not only about your physical body, but about what is happening also mentally and emotionally. Hope is something, it's not a dishonest thing. Hope is actually a very honest thing. And this is, if you have like a doctor and a patient who are both committed to hope for the patient's recovery, that's when this placebo effect is something that can, make a difference in a person's health. So hope is powerful. Hope is real. Hope has a real effect. So what does it mean to actually hope? To hope means that one way of thinking about it is it's almost like, we have these senses, right? Of like, this is the way it is now. This is the way we remember the past. It's a way of looking forward to the future, almost like you're remembering the future as if it's already happened, knowing that the future could possibly be better than the past, right? Like the future could be possibly better than the past or what's happening right now. And it has been an essential part of human development, like our development just as humans. 400,000 years ago, or for 400,000 years, like our human ancestors were making the same tools. They were going out, they were finding the same roots and berries. And it was about 150,000 years ago that humans started using bones to make needles. They started, to sew things. They started carving ivory to make fertility goddesses to help someone conceive. They started experimenting with last year's wheat harvest to figure out how to make next year's wheat harvest better. All of these creative, farmers, artists, shamans, all of these people, they were all envisioning a better future. They had a hope that something could change, that they could have some sort of an effect on the future to make a better future. There is a huge difference between suffering. Suffering is just a human condition, right? We're all going to go through suffering. Always happens, always will. There's a big difference between having suffering without hope and feeling a loss of control and suffering with hope. If you are suffering with hope, that's when suffering becomes a manageable and temporary pain instead of a source of despair. Despair is just giving up. Like those rats who were swimming in the bucket, they had no sense of like that anything could happen. They're like, this is it, my life is over. There's no hope. We need hope in order to be able to keep functioning in the face of fear, which is always going to be there, and setback, which is also always going to be there. But as I said, the opposite of hope is despair. Despair comes from the Latin word disperare, which means to be without hope. So if you have hope, that helps you envision moving past maybe some prior despair when you had no hope to these future possibilities. How can things be better? I believe that things can be better. I hope that things can be better. Despair is extremely emotional. Hope is also very emotional. It may not seem to be logical, may not seem to be reasonable, but it is essential to being human, and it is powerful, as we just learned from the fact that about the antidepressant drugs. It isn't logical or reasonable that would be effective, that placebos would just be effective, but they are. And we can look around at nature also for inspiration. And remember, humans are nature. Look around at things like the way that like trees keep dispersing these seeds out, you know, the way that one season just follows another, like watching the cycles, the way that happens, the way that shrubs and grasses and wildflowers will grow new stems after their tender little shoot is killed by fire. And you can also feel it in your own cycles, maybe in like your womb cycles. You're noticing this, how things change. Even the cycle of day and night. Like for me, I know personally at night, things can sometimes start feeling kind of bleak. And if I get a really good night's sleep, then I wake up in the morning and I feel so much more optimistic. You may also notice these different kinds of cycles that have to do with going off on your own and maybe isolating yourself. You feel more hopeless when you're isolated, and you feel more hopeful when you bring yourself back in and you're actually around other optimistic people. Now, if you are in a place where you are really searching for inspiration right now to keep going, or inspiration to be hopeful, if you haven't read this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl, read this. It's an amazing book. It is incredibly inspirational, and it may seem like it wouldn't be, because this is the story of a psychiatrist who was a prisoner for many years in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. He wasn't working as a doctor. He was put to work digging tunnels. It was, you know, an extremely like unimaginably horrific life. However, this is a very inspirational and hopeful book, because of what he talks about what he discovered during that time when he was in the concentration camps, about how people survived, and he talks about how he was able to survive, and it has to do with what was going on internally. So after he survived, when he was practicing again as a doctor, one of the things he would ask his patients is he would ask them, why do you not commit suicide? So patients that were coming in that were feeling very depressed, why do you not commit suicide? And the reason why he was doing this is he wanted to find these sort of guidelines that he was going to pull out and use those for his therapy work with them. Because he wanted to know, what is your why? Like, what is keeping you going? Is it that you have some kind of a talent that you want to use? You know, maybe you have something that brings you joy, that brings other people joy, that you make a difference in some way, something that you do, some kind of activity or talent. Maybe it's some kind of a difference that you want to make in the world. Maybe it's a connection to a cause. Maybe it's a connection to loved ones, or to some other kind of living being, some other kind of wild animal or domesticated animal, or whatever it is. Maybe it's a connection to loved ones. Maybe it's a connection you have to the planet. It's like rooting you back to your values. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." And what Dr. Frankl discovered, and how he worked with his patients, is he knew that in the why, that is where you can find hope. And that hope can also help guide your actions as you're moving forward. Now, something Dr. Frankl witnessed in the concentration camps was how people gave up hope, what happened when they gave up hope. So here's an example of that he gives in the book that has to do with a friend of his who had a wish rather than a hope. Now, what happened with his friend had a dream that he was able to know the day that the camp that they were in, would be liberated, and his suffering would be over, that all of their suffering would be over. And so he had this fantasy, this wish, and he decided it was March 30th. So as the day grew close, it seemed more and more unlikely that the war was going to end, that they were going to be liberated. He began realizing this. So March 30th, this day that he thought He wished that the camp was going to be liberated. It didn't happen. He became delirious and he lost consciousness. And on the 31st, he died. He had a wish instead of like a true hope. And I want to read a little passage from Frankl's book here. Now, remember, this is before they did these rat studies. He says in here, Dr. Frankl writes, those who know how close the connection is between the state of mind of a man, his courage and hope, or lack of them, and the state of immunity of his body will understand that the sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. The ultimate cause of my friend's death was that the expected liberation did not come, and he was severely disappointed. This suddenly lowered his body's resistance against the latent typhus infection. Many of them were just walking around with sickness in them, basically almost all the time. His faith in the future and his will to live had become paralyzed, and his body fell victim to illness, and thus the voice of his dream was right after all. So the question is then, so what can we do? Like if we want to cultivate hope, what is it that we can do? And Dr. Frankl writes on another in another section here. He says, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And then he talks about the choices that even though they were being herded around like animals and treated like animals, you know, their name was taken away from them. They were given a number, but he says there were still always choices to make. And then he talks about how he says every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. And then here on page 85, so just have a couple more passages that I want to read from here because they're so powerful and inspiring. It says, what was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing men that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life, hourly and daily. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and in right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. And that to me is extremely powerful. And that is why one of the things, like on Saturday for our Waterfall Wonders and Wanders event, I offered a practice that I have learned that I do quite frequently, which is looking outward for answers. I go inward and I get contemplative and all of that kind of stuff, but I move outside of myself. I look outside of myself for answers. It has to do with what is life asking from me? Not what am I asking from life, but what is life asking from me? We can get so focused in on our own selves, and that can make us physically sick. I have another I talk about my sister, I feel like all the time, but I have another story that has to do with my sister that maybe I'll tell another time. That is another really great example of this. So the last section I'd like to read out of this little paragraph here, where he says, it's called the essence of existence. And he says, this emphasis on responsibleness is reflected in the categorical imperative of logotherapy. This is something that he created coming out of the concentration camp, which is, and I love this so much, Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. It seems to me there's nothing which would stimulate a man's sense of responsibleness more than this maxim, which invites him to imagine first that the present is past, and second, that the past may yet be changed and amended. It confronts him with life's finiteness as well as the finality of what he makes out of both his life and himself. So he's saying to imagine that the life that you're living right now is, it's sort of like it's a wonderful life. Like you are given a second chance at life, and that everything that has happened, yes, everything that has happened has already happened. And what you're about to do that is like the wrong decision, to imagine that it has already happened and you've already made this mistake in the past, and you now are given a chance to make it right. It's like, what are you going to do in order to make it right? And I'd like to end with this one last little quote from Paul McCartney. He had a dream about his mother, Mary, who died when he was 14. And when he woke up from that dream, he wrote a song that we all know and we all love. And one of the phrases from that song says, "And when the night is cloudy, there is still a light that shines on me. Shine until tomorrow, let it be." So the power of hope. Hoping, it's real, it makes a difference. And I hope that you really take some time to think about this and cultivate hope in your life. If you're one of those people like all of us who need to remember to keep cultivating the power of hope in our lives. I love you so much. Sobriety is hopeful. Sobriety is a hopeful place to be. Stay sober, stay cool. I love you. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.